The candle had burned down to a stub by the time Nora Ashvale found the page that changed everything. She had not meant to stay this long. When she had first unlocked the door to Callum's study 3 weeks after his burial, she told herself she was only looking for the deed to the house, the one document she needed before the solicitor came on Friday morning. She would be in and out before the kettle finished boiling. That was what she had told herself, but the room had other intentions. Callum Ashvale's study was not a large space, but it held the accumulated weight of 20 years the way old wood holds water, slowly, silently, in every grain. Books lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. Ledgers occupied the lower shelves in careful rows, their spines labeled in his neat hand. Land registry, correspondence, council matters, settlement hearings. The labels were orderly, almost cheerful in their precision, as if the man who wrote them had believed that naming a thing was the same as understanding it. Nora had always admired his handwriting. Even now, looking at it made something tighten in her chest. She sat at his desk with the candle burning low and the rain beginning outside. It had come on suddenly, the way storms did in that high country, without warning and without apology, and now it drummed against the window glass in a rhythm that felt almost conversational, as if it had things to say and was saying them whether she listened or not. The deed she had been searching for turned out to be in the second drawer on the left, exactly where a sensible man would have kept it. She found it within 10 minutes. She should have taken it and gone back to the kitchen where the fire was still warm. Instead, she opened the first ledger. She told herself she was not searching for anything. She was simply a woman trying to understand the life her husband had led, the one that had existed in this room while she had existed in the rest of the house. 20 years of marriage, and she had come into this study perhaps 24 times. Callum had not forbidden her. He had simply never invited her, and she had learned, the way women of her circumstances learn most things, to read the shape of a closed door. Now the door was open. She was the one closing it behind her. The first ledger was dry work. Minutes from community meetings, lists of names, parcels of land described in the bloodless language of measurement, boundary lines and bearing points, distances rendered in the cold arithmetic of survey work, north boundary markers, water rights. She read with the patience of someone who had spent years transcribing correspondence for a trading firm before her marriage, back when she had been Nora Fenn and had paid her own rent and eaten bread she had purchased herself. That version of herself had been very good at reading documents that other people found tedious. She had a memory that worked like water finding the low places in stone. Whatever passed through it left a mark. She had not used that memory in a very long time. By the third ledger, she had begun to notice something. Not an inconsistency, exactly. More like a rhythm she had not expected. In every settlement hearing Callum had mediated over the span of 15 years, there was a pattern to the outcomes that only became visible when you read them in sequence rather than isolation. The same parcels of land appeared in multiple hearings, described differently each time, their boundaries shifting by small degrees between one document and the next. Not enough to startle anyone reading a single file, enough to matter, accumulated over time. She turned the page and the rain said something sharp against the glass. It was a land boundary agreement, dated several years back, bearing Callum's seal and 3 signatures. Standard enough. But the third signature, the one marked as independent witness, had been written over something else. She brought the candle closer. The original ink beneath was darker, pressed deeper into the paper. Someone had written a name there. and then that name had been covered by another, traced so carefully over the original that at a glance they appeared identical. Nora had spent 3 years of her young life copying documents for men who dictated too fast and cared too little about legibility. She knew the difference between a signature written fresh and a signature written over something that had come before. She knew the difference between the pressure of a pen moving freely and the pressure of a pen being guided. She set the page down on the desk. She sat very still. Outside, the rain fell. The candle flame bent sideways in a draft from somewhere, and then straightened again, as if it had thought better of going out. Nora did not sleep that night. She read until the candle died, and then she lit another one. And when that one guttered, she wrapped herself in the heavy wool blanket she had taken from the chest in the hall and sat in the gray pre-dawn light and kept reading. By the time the window began to show the pale smudge of morning, she had gone through 4 ledgers and made no notes. She did not need to. Every page she read was already somewhere in her, filed in whatever part of her mind had always worked this way, orderly and relentless, and entirely her own. What she had found was this. Her husband had been the most trusted man in the territory for 20 years. He had stood between 2 communities when they might have gone to war over water or fence lines or grazing rights. He had sat at tables where angry men brought their grievances, and he had listened with the patience of someone who genuinely believed that most conflicts were misunderstandings waiting to be corrected. She had loved him for that. She had been proud of him for that. What she had also found, laid out in 15 years of ledgers like a map drawn in invisible ink that only became visible at a certain angle, was that every settlement he had mediated had the same beneficiary. The boundaries moved in one direction. The water rights flowed to one side. The grazing parcels contracted for the families of the Duskwater community and expanded for the men whose names appeared again and again on the other side of the table. And in every single case, the documentation was clean. The proceedings orderly, the language precise, her husband's handwriting on every page, neat and careful and entirely correct. She sat in the gray morning light and held that knowledge the way you hold something very hot, carefully, with the understanding that putting it down will not make it less real. She was still sitting there when she heard the gate. Nora rose and went to the window. A man was coming up the path from the road, well dressed in the careful way of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of argument. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how the morning would go, and he carried in one hand a cloth-wrapped parcel that she recognized, even from this distance, as fresh bread. She could smell it, or imagined she could, warm and yeasty through the glass. She had met Silas Pryor 3 times before this morning. Once at Callum's funeral, where he had pressed her hand and said the right words in the right tone. Once at a community gathering 2 years before Callum died, where he had spoken warmly about the importance of fair dealings between neighbors. Once, briefly, in the street, where he had tipped his hat and called her Mrs. Ashvale, with a warmth that she had taken, at the time, for simple courtesy. She went to the door before he knocked. He was perhaps 50, with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent reasonableness, the kind of face that made you want to believe whatever came out of it. He presented the bread with both hands, a gesture of such practiced sincerity that Nora felt something in her go very quiet and very watchful. Mrs. Ashvale, his voice was warm. I hope I am not calling too early. I wanted to look in on you before the week got away from me. Callum was a dear friend to this community, and I think we all feel his absence more than we have had the chance to say." "Thank you," Nora said. "That is very kind. I hope you are managing the practical matters without too much difficulty. If there is anything in the way of paperwork or arrangements that I can help to sort out, I would consider it a privilege. Callum trusted me with a great deal over the years, and I am familiar with most of his affairs." The word affairs sat in the air between them for a moment. "I appreciate the offer," Nora said. "I think I have things in hand, but I will certainly call on you if I need to." Something passed through his eyes. Not suspicion, not quite. More like a small recalculation, brief and controlled, before the warmth returned. He said a few more things, kind things, the appropriate things, and then he took his leave. She watched him go from the doorway. He reached the gate, paused, and said something to the young man who had been waiting on the road, and she saw, rather than heard, the direction of his attention, the slight tilt of his chin toward her house. She went back inside and stood in the hall for a moment with the bread in her hands. Then she put it on the kitchen table and went back to Callum's study. She needed to find someone who could read a survey map. In a town this size, where everyone knew everyone and most people's opinions of a stranger had been formed before that stranger had finished introducing themselves, word traveled faster than intention. Nora understood this. She had lived here for 20 years, and she knew the social architecture of the place the way she knew the floor plan of her own house, which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in wet weather, where the drafts came from in winter. She asked 3 people over the course of the morning. A woman at the dry goods counter who had known Callum since before their marriage. The solicitor's clerk, who was young and helpful and knew the name of every professional in the territory. And old Mrs. Farren, who sat on the bench outside the feed store in all weather and could tell you the history of any family within a 40-mile radius. Each time she said the name Gideon Vara, the response was the same. A pause, a small shift in posture, a rerouting of the conversation towards somewhere safer. Mrs. Farren was the most direct of the 3. She looked at Nora for a long moment with her pale eyes and then said, quietly enough that it was only between the 2 of them, "Do not go looking for that man unless there is no other road, Mrs. Ashvale. And if you do find yourself on that road, do not tell anyone you are on it." It was not a comfort, but it was, Nora recognized, genuine advice rather than empty warning. Mrs. Farren was not a woman who wasted words on the dramatic. She rode out that afternoon. Gideon Vare's place was at the edge of what most people called the good land, where the terrain began its long, slow argument with itself, flattening out on one side into decent grazing and rising on the other into rock and thin soil and the kind of landscape that only suited people who had decided they did not need much from the world. The house was small and functional and had the look of a place that had been maintained without being cared for. The way a man maintains something when maintaining it is merely the alternative to watching it fall down. She tied her horse at the post and knocked. The door opened, and she understood immediately why people went quiet when she said his name. Gideon Vara was perhaps 45, with a face that had seen considerable weather and made no attempt to disguise the fact. He was lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate when they remembered to, with hands that were calloused and ink-stained in equal measure. But it was his eyes that made her stop for a fraction of a second before she spoke. They were the eyes of someone who had made a long and thorough study of disappointment and arrived, on the other side of it, at something that was not quite resignation and not quite peace, but was in the territory of both. He looked at her. He looked at the saddlebag over her shoulder. He looked at the papers showing at the top of it. "That is Callum Ashvale's handwriting," he said. His voice was flat, not hostile, just stripped of any pretense that he was going to pretend not to recognize what he was looking at. "Yes," she held his gaze, "I am his wife." Something happened behind his eyes, complex and quick, like weather changing over high ground. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she did not look away. And whatever he was deciding, he decided it. He stepped back and held the door open. She walked in. The first thing she saw was the wall. It covered most of the main room, and it was a map, or rather it was a collection of maps layered and extended and corrected over what appeared to be years of careful work, drawn on paper that had been pinned and repinned until the edges curled and the surface was cross-hatched with marks in at least 3 different colors of ink. She had seen official survey maps before. She had handled the ones in Callum's ledgers with the detached competence of someone processing documents rather than reading them. This was different. This was not a document. This was an argument. Every line on that wall was a position someone had taken, and every correction was evidence that someone else had disagreed, and the whole accumulated record of it covered the wall like a conversation that had been going on for years and had not yet reached its conclusion. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the wall, and then at the papers in her bag, and then back at the wall, because she was already seeing it, the overlap, the way the terrain in his maps corresponded to the records in Callum's ledgers, not perfectly, not in every detail, but enough. Enough to see that they were describing the same piece of ground from 2 different directions and arriving at 2 very different pictures of where the lines should fall. "Your husband's records," Gideon said from behind her. He had not moved far. "How many years?" 15 that I have gone through. There may be more." A silence. She could not see his face from where she was standing. "Why did you come here?" he asked, not unkindly, simply directly, in the manner of someone who had learned that circumnavigation took longer than the journey warranted. Nora turned around. She looked at him steadily in the low afternoon light that came through the single west-facing window. "Because your name is in 3 of those records," she said, "and because the signature over yours is the same hand that signed everything else." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves. Gideon Vera looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the table, pulled out one of the 2 chairs, and sat down. He did not invite her to take the other chair, but he did not prevent it either. And after a moment, she took it. He folded his hands on the table, his ink-stained, calloused hands, folded carefully, the way a man folds his hands when he is trying to keep them still. 8 years ago, he said, I submitted a survey that showed the Duskwater boundary running along the ridgeline, which is where it has always been, and where every prior record confirmed it to be. 2 weeks later, my survey was declared invalid on the grounds that the witness signature was fraudulent. He paused. I lost my license, my commission, the work I had spent 12 years building. Another pause, shorter. The witness who allegedly signed falsely was never questioned. The settlement proceeded without my testimony. The boundary was redrawn. Nora did not speak. She waited. The name of the man who confirmed the original signature was legitimate, and then retracted that confirmation, Gideon said, was Callum Ashvale. The wind moved outside. The afternoon light held steady in the window, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. Nora did not drop her eyes. She did not reach for denial or deflection or any of the protective gestures that the moment might have permitted. She sat with it the way she had sat with the ledgers in the gray pre-dawn dark, with the steady patience of someone who has decided that the truth, whatever shape it takes, is preferable to the comfort of not knowing. "I see," she said finally. Her voice was even. Gideon watched her. Whatever he had expected from the wife of the man who had ruined him, it did not appear to be this. "Show me your maps," Nora said. "All of them." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he stood up and went to the wall and began. They worked until the light failed. Gideon did not explain things the way a teacher explains to a student. He spoke to the wall the way a man speaks to something he has argued with for a very long time, pointing and correcting, and occasionally going silent for a stretch that Nora learned to read as thinking rather than reluctance. She did not ask him to slow down. She kept pace with him, and when she did not understand something, she said so plainly, and when she did understand something, she said nothing at all, because understanding was its own sufficient response, and he seemed to know the difference. By the time the window went from gold to gray, she had a picture in her mind that was considerably more complete than the one she had arrived with, and considerably more troubling. The Duskwater lands were old, not old in the way that everything in that country was old, shaped by wind and water over time beyond counting, but old in the way of an agreement made between people who had decided to share a world rather than fight over it. The original boundary had been established long before the current wave of settlement, when the territory was different in character, if not in geography. It had been recorded, imperfectly but genuinely, in documents that predated Callum's tenure as community mediator by 30 years. What Gideon's map showed, laid out across that wall in his three-color system of documentation, was a slow migration. The boundary had not been moved in any single dramatic act. It had been nudged, settlement hearing by settlement hearing, each one small enough to appear reasonable in isolation, each one shifting the line by some increment that a reasonable person might attribute to clarification rather than alteration. Taken individually, each adjustment was defensible. Taken together, they described something that was not defensible at all. "How long did it take you to see the whole pattern?" Nora asked. Gideon was quiet for a moment, standing with his arms crossed looking at the wall. 3 years after I lost my license," he said. "I did not have anything else to do with my time." There was no self-pity in the statement. It was simply a fact delivered in the tone of a man who had processed his bitterness somewhere in the intervening years and arrived at a drier country on the other side. Nora looked at him. "And when you saw it?" "I had no license, no standing, no one to bring it to, who did not already know and had not already decided to know nothing." He unfolded his arms and picked up one of the ink markers from the shelf below the map. He turned it over in his fingers, not marking anything, just holding it. A man without a name is a man without a voice. That is not a complaint. That is just how it works. Nora thought about that on the ride home. The dark came in fast, as it always did in that season, and her horse knew the road better than she did by then, so she let the animal find its own pace and sat with the particular weight of a day that had rearranged things. Not dramatically. Nothing had exploded or collapsed. She had simply looked at what was in front of her long enough to see its actual shape, and now she could not unsee it. And that was its own kind of change. She unsaddled her horse, went inside, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she thought. What she had were ledgers with irregular signatures and a pattern that required the whole 15-year sequence to become visible. What she had was a disgraced surveyor with meticulous maps and no credibility in the eyes of anyone who might act on what those maps showed. What she had was a husband who was dead and therefore could not confirm or deny anything, and a community that had trusted him absolutely and would not welcome the suggestion that their trust had been misplaced. What she did not have was a single piece of evidence that would stand on its own in front of anyone who mattered. She poured the cold tea down the sink and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Silas Prairie came back on the third day. She had been expecting him, in the way you expect weather when you have read the sky correctly. He arrived in the late morning when the light was good and the street was busy enough that being seen calling on a widow was an entirely ordinary act of community consideration. He brought nothing this time, no bread, no pretense of nourishment, just himself, and the permanent reasonableness of his expression, and the sense he carried of a man who had never once been surprised by how a conversation turned out. "I heard you had been out to the Vara place," he said. He said it pleasantly, as if remarking on something of mild and passing interest, the way a person comments on weather or the state of the road after a wet week. Nora had prepared for several versions of this conversation. She had run them through her mind the previous evening, laid them out like documents, considered their structure and their possible directions. She was, when she needed to be, very good at preparation. "I was looking for someone who could help me understand the survey records in Callum's files," she said. "I have been trying to get a sense of the land holdings associated with some of the settlements he managed for the estate." The word estate did useful work. It implied a finite purpose, an ending point, a project that would conclude and then be over. Prairie nodded. His expression was attentive and warm. "Of course, though I would caution you a little, Mrs. Ashvale, about relying on Vare for anything of that nature. His history in this territory is not a simple one. There are things about his conduct in the work he used to do that I do not think have been fully aired in public, and I would hate for you to find yourself forming impressions based on a partial picture." "I appreciate the concern," Nora said. "He has a particular way of presenting himself that can seem convincing. I have seen it before with men of his type, very detailed, very certain, very committed to a version of events that happens to cast themselves in a favorable light." He paused, letting that land gently. "Grief makes us vulnerable to that kind of certainty. It can feel like solid ground when everything else is shifting." It was skillfully done. Nora acknowledged it internally, the way you acknowledge a well-executed move in a game you are playing against someone whose strategy you are only beginning to understand. The implied suggestion that she was emotionally compromised and therefore unreliable as a judge of information, delivered entirely through apparent concern for her well-being. "You are very thoughtful," she said. "I will keep that in mind." He left 10 minutes later. She watched him go from the window. This time he did not stop to speak to anyone on the road, and she thought that was more interesting than if he had. She went back to Gideon's place that afternoon. She did not announce herself in advance, partly because there was no practical way to do so, and partly because she had decided that the kind of work they were doing did not benefit from too much interval between sessions. Evidence had a way of becoming abstract when you were not actively engaged with it. She preferred to keep it concrete. He opened the door before she knocked. He had apparently heard the horse. "Prairie came to see me this morning," she said, stepping inside. Gideon closed the door. "What did he say?" "That you have a particular way of presenting yourself that can seem convincing." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, not quite pain. A compressed expression that contained elements of both. "That is accurate, actually," he said. "I do have that. It used to be more useful than it is now." They spread the ledgers across the table, Nora's copies alongside Gideon's maps, and began the work of correlation. It was detailed and slow, and required a kind of attention that shut out everything else, which Nora found, to her mild surprise, that she welcomed. There was relief in work that demanded all of you. It left no room for the other things. She had read through 7 of the ledgers in Callum's study. Gideon had records going back further than that, and the process of matching the 2 sets of documents was like fitting together pieces from 2 different versions of the same picture. Sometimes they aligned perfectly. Sometimes there were gaps that each set could illuminate for the other. And sometimes, in the places where the 2 sources converged, they found something that neither set alone would have revealed. It was in one of those convergence points that Nora stopped. She was holding a boundary settlement from perhaps a dozen years back, one she had read in the study, but paid less attention to because it had seemed straightforward. A small parcel, a minor dispute, a quick resolution. She had noted the irregular witness signature and moved on. But now, cross-referenced against Gideon's timeline of the larger transactions, she could see that this particular settlement had occurred in the same season as a much larger transfer of grazing rights that had gone unremarked in the official record. A transfer that would have been legally impossible unless the small parcel had already changed hands first. The small settlement had come first. By 2 weeks, exactly. She set the pages down on the table between them. "Someone planned the sequence," she said. Gideon looked up from what he had been reading. She slid the 2 documents across to him without speaking. He read them. He read them again. Then he set them back down very carefully, the way you set something down when you are managing a response that you do not want to be visible on your face. "This is not Callum Ashvale operating independently," Nora said. "This level of coordination required someone who understood the legal architecture from the inside, who knew which piece needed to move before the next piece could follow." She paused. "My husband was meticulous. He was careful. But he was not this kind of strategic." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light held steady on the table between them, warming the edges of the pages. "His father," he said finally. Nora looked at him. "Prairie's father. He was the land agent in this territory for 30 years before his son took over the business." Gideon's voice was measured, delivering this the way he delivered most things, as fact that had been held for a long time, and had therefore lost its capacity to surprise him, though it had clearly never lost its capacity to matter. Every major land transaction in this area for 3 decades had his name somewhere in it. When he died, Silas Prairie stepped into the position without missing a quarter. Same clients, same methods, same understanding of how the legal architecture could be navigated by someone patient enough to work at the pace of paperwork rather than the pace of confrontation. "You knew this already." "I suspected it. I could not prove which generation had initiated what." He tapped the document she had slid across the table. "This helps." Nora leaned back in her chair and looked at the wall. She thought about her husband, who had been a careful man, a methodical man, a man who had believed, she thought genuinely, in the value of order and agreement and the resolution of conflict through patient conversation. She had loved him for that quality. She had built 20 years of her own life around the stability that quality seemed to promise. She thought about what it would cost a man like that to look the other way, once, and then twice, and then 10 times, and then 15 years of times. She thought about what you became, incrementally, in the process of paying that cost, and whether you knew you were becoming it, and whether knowing would have made any difference at all. She did not say any of this aloud. Gideon did not ask. That was another thing she was learning about him, that he had a precise sense of which silences to enter and which ones to leave undisturbed. After a while, she returned to the documents. He returned to his maps. The afternoon wore on. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves that the window framed like something deliberate, like a painting of patience. The work was quiet and absorbing, and occasionally punctuated by one of them saying something short and specific that the other would respond to with equal brevity, and the conversation that accumulated over those hours was nothing like the conversations Nora had been accustomed to. Nothing like the careful social exchanges of 20 years of communal life in a small town where every word carried social weight and every question implied a relationship. This was different. This was two people talking about evidence, and the evidence was doing most of the talking. It was in the late afternoon, when the light had gone from white to gold, and Nora's back had begun to register its objections to the chair, that she found the name. It appeared in 4 of the most significant settlements, always listed as an independent witness, always appearing on the side of the transaction that had benefited from the boundary change. The name was neither prominent nor obscure, the kind of name that attached itself to records without calling attention to itself, doing its work quietly in the administrative margins of events whose drama was located elsewhere. She had passed it 3 times before it accumulated enough repetition to become visible. She said it aloud. Gideon went still. It was a particular kind of stillness, the kind that comes not from surprise but from recognition of something long anticipated arriving at last. "He is still alive," he said slowly. Or was, the last time anyone in town had word of him. He moved out to the far edge of the Duskwater lands some years ago. Stopped coming into town entirely. People mostly assumed he had become unwell. "Have you tried to speak with him?" The question sat between them without apology. Gideon looked at the table for a moment before answering. 4 years ago, he said, I rode out there. He sent word through his granddaughter that he had nothing to say and did not wish to receive visitors. He paused. I did not go back. A man can be told he is not welcome only so many times before the message becomes clear. Nora looked at him. He might speak to someone he has not already turned away. Gideon met her eyes. She could see him considering it. Not the possibility itself, but the weight of hoping for something that had already been refused once, the particular cost of trying again when you had already absorbed the result of the first attempt. Perhaps, he said. She rode back that evening as the last light was draining out of the sky, the pale ground going silver and then gray around her, the town appearing at the end of the road as a cluster of warm windows in the gathering dark. She was 2 miles out when she let herself think about what the day had produced and what it had not. And by the time she reached the stable, she had the shape of the next move in her mind, though not yet its details. She unsaddled her horse, went inside, and found the envelope on the kitchen table. It had been left through the front window, which she had left unlatched in the morning. She picked it up. Her name on the front, in handwriting she did not recognize. The letters formed with a careful deliberateness that suggested someone writing more slowly than their natural hand. Inside, a single folded paper. She opened it at the kitchen table with the lamp still unlit, reading in the last gray light from the window. 4 words. She read them twice. Then she folded the paper back into the envelope and set it down on the table, and stood in the unlighted kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. The note said, "Wren Duskwater knows everything." She was at Gideon's place before the morning had fully committed to its direction. The sky was still deciding what kind of day it intended to be, running through its preliminary palette of pale colors, and the ground mist lay in the low places like something that had not yet received instruction to move. He answered the door with a mug in his hand and the look of a man who had been awake for some time already, which did not surprise her. She held out the envelope without preamble. He set his mug on the table by the door and took it, read it, read it again. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the way a compass needle settles when it has found its direction. "Wren Duskwater," he said. "You know her." "I know of her. I have spoken with her once, briefly, years ago." He handed the envelope back. "She is the elder of the Duskwater community. Before that, she was their record keeper, the person responsible for maintaining their own account of the land and its history, going back further than the official registry recognizes." He picked up his mug again. "If anyone holds an original account of where the boundary actually was before all of this began, it is her. Then she is the missing piece. She is a possible missing piece. There is a difference." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "She has had years to come forward with whatever she knows. She has not done so. That means either what she holds is not enough on its own, or she has reasons for waiting that we do not yet understand, or both." Nora looked at the envelope in her hand. "Someone sent this note. Someone who knows what we are doing and knows about Wren Duskwater, and made a deliberate choice to point us toward her." She thought about the handwriting, careful and slow. Someone writing with intention rather than habit. That is a person with a stake in the outcome. Or a person who has been waiting for someone to come asking the right questions, Gideon said, and the way he said it was quiet and serious in equal measure, as if he were weighing the possibility rather than dismissing it. She tucked the envelope into her coat. The morning was sharpening around them, the mist beginning its slow retreat, and the light beginning to commit to warmth. She looked at the horizon, that long, unbroken line where the sky met the ground, and thought about everything that lay between here and the far edge of the Duskwater lands. Not just in distance, but in the more complicated geography of trust and history, and what it costs to cross certain kinds of territory without an invitation. Going in there without being asked is not straightforward, Gideon said. He was watching her face. Not for me. My history with the Duskwater community is complicated by what happened 8 years ago, by the fact that the fraud I was trying to expose was also a fraud against them, and the line between a man who tried to stop something and a man who failed to stop it is not always clear from the outside. And for me, Nora said, I am the widow of the man who facilitated it. Yes, she let that sit. Then she said, we need Wren Duskwater, and we need the old witness. The witness to confirm the forgery from the inside. Wren to provide the original record that shows what the boundary looked like before any of this began. She looked at him. One without the other is still arguable. Together, they closed the room. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she watched something move through his expression that was difficult to name precisely because it was not a single thing. It was the particular look of someone recalculating the odds of something they had already decided the odds of, and finding that the calculation had changed, and not yet being certain what to do with that change. "Prairie will know we are moving faster," he said. "He already knows about our meetings. If he hears we are heading toward Duskwater territory, toward the one person who might have the original record, he will not wait to see how it plays out." "Then we should be faster than he expects," Nora said. The morning was fully itself by then, the mist gone and the light clean and falling straight. From somewhere past the fence line, a bird was stating its position at length to an audience that had not requested the speech. Gideon looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she had begun to recognize, the one that was not evaluation and was not quite something else yet, but was moving in that direction with the patient, unhurried steadiness of water finding its level. He went inside. He came back with a second mug, which he held out without ceremony. She took it. The tea was strong and slightly too hot, and she drank it standing at his door with the morning laid out before them, and he stood beside her and did the same, and the silence between them was not comfortable in any simple sense, but it was no longer guarded, and that was its own kind of shift. That evening, returning to collect a ledger she had left behind, Nora found the paddock gate standing open. Her horse had not wandered far, finding a patch of grazing in the low hollow nearby, unhurried and unbothered by its freedom. But the gate latch showed fresh marks, clean and deliberate, the work of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and wanted it to be understood in return. Gideon brought the horse back without comment. He stood at the paddock fence and looked at the latch for a long moment, then looked at the road that ran back through open ground toward town, and then looked at her. "You can ride back tonight," he said, "or you can stay." He said it the way he said most things, with the direct economy of someone who had decided that the words available to him were exactly sufficient and that adding more would only dilute them. "There is the chair by the fire. It is not built for comfort, but it is inside, and the door has a bolt." Nora looked at the open road. She thought about the note on her kitchen table, and the man who had come to her door with fresh bread and a pleasantly arranged face, and a very clear set of intentions. She thought about riding 2 miles through open ground in the dark on a night when someone had already demonstrated a willingness to send a message through her property. "The chair will do," she said. He went inside without further comment, and she followed, and he put another log on the fire, and she settled into the chair with the ledger she had come back for, and the small notebook she had begun carrying in her coat pocket, the one she used to record the things she wanted to hold in a form outside her memory. He took the table and his maps, and the fire made the room warm, and the night pressed against the window without getting in, and they worked in a silence that had changed its quality again, almost imperceptibly, the way the temperature of a room changes when a second person enters it. A shift you register in your body before you register it anywhere else. Somewhere in the second hour, when the fire had settled into its low, steady burning, and the papers spread between them had acquired the intimate disorder of things long handled, Nora looked up from a line in the ledger that had stopped her and found that Gideon had already looked up. He was not studying her. He was simply looking, the way a person looks at something when they have briefly stopped remembering to look away. He returned to his maps. She returned to the ledger. The fire burned on. Outside, the night held its own council, and Nora sat in a chair that was not comfortable and thought about the note in her coat pocket, 4 words in a careful hand, and the old witness on the far edge of the Duskwater lands who had once refused to speak, and the elder who knew everything and had said nothing, and all the people in this story who had been waiting, in their various ways and at their various costs, for the right questions to finally arrive. She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands in the firelight, the hands that remembered every page they had touched, that held the whole accumulated record of 15 years in the architecture of their memory. She thought about what those hands were capable of, and what they had never been asked to do before, and what might be possible now that the asking had finally come. Tomorrow they would go to Wren Duskwater. Whether the elder would receive them, whether she would offer what she held, whether what she held would be enough, none of that was decided. But the attempt was decided and the direction was decided. And Nora had learned in the past several days that there was a specific kind of courage required not for the dramatic confrontations, but for the ordinary act of showing up, of arriving at the door of a difficult thing and knocking. She had not known she possessed that kind of courage before this week. She was still learning its dimensions. The fire settled with a soft sound. Across the table, Gideon turned a page. The night continued its long, patient work around them, and morning was coming, and there was still a great deal left to do. The road to the Duskwater lands was not marked on any official map that Nora had found in Callum's study. It existed in the way that certain kinds of knowledge existed in that country, passed between people who needed it and withheld from people who did not. A living thing rather than a recorded one. Gideon knew it. He had ridden it once before, years ago, on the errand that had ended in a closed door and a granddaughter's polite refusal, and he rode it now without hesitation, the way a person navigates by memory when the memory is the kind that does not fade. Nora rode beside him. Neither of them spoke much in the first hour. The morning was cool, and the ground was hard from a dry stretch, and the horses moved at an easy pace that covered distance without urgency. She watched the landscape change as they left the territory she knew, the familiar geometry of fences and cultivated land giving way to something older and less arranged, the ground rising and breaking into formations that suggested the land had its own opinions about the shape of things. She had been thinking since before dawn about what Wren Duskwater might be. She had constructed several versions in the hours of the early morning, lying awake in the chair while the fire died down and the room went from warm to merely not cold. An elder who had endured. A woman who had watched her community's land diminish by careful degrees, and had held the knowledge of it like a stone in her chest for years. A person who had sent a note, or had caused a note to be sent, 4 words in a deliberate hand, pointing 2 strangers in a direction she had chosen. The camp appeared in a fold of land that the approach road had concealed entirely until they were almost upon it, which Nora suspected was not accidental. It was not large. Perhaps a dozen structures arranged with a logic she could not immediately read, but which conveyed, even to an outside eye, the sense of a community that had been in one place long enough to understand the place, and let the place understand it back. A young woman came out to meet them before they had fully dismounted. She looked at Gideon with an expression that was neutral and unsurprised, and then she looked at Nora for a longer moment, with an expression that was more difficult to categorize. "She is expecting you," the young woman said. She did not elaborate on how this was possible, and neither of them asked. Wren Duskwater was perhaps 60, perhaps more. She was seated outside her dwelling on a low wooden chair that had been worn smooth by long use, and she had the quality of stillness that Nora associated with people who had learned to conserve themselves, who had understood at some point that energy spent on performance was energy unavailable for the things that actually required it. She wore her gray hair loose to her shoulders. Her hands rested in her lap with the particular ease of hands that had done decades of work and had earned their rest. She looked at Gideon first. Something passed between them that Nora could not fully read, a recognition that was not warm but was not hostile either, the acknowledgement of two people who have occupied opposite corners of the same story for a long time and have arrived, through their separate routes, at the same point. Then she looked at Nora. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was not soft, but it was measured, each word given its full weight and no more. "Both of you." They sat on the ground in front of her, which felt appropriate in a way that Nora did not try to analyze. There was something about being lower than Wren Duskwater that seemed simply correct, a spatial arrangement that reflected something true. "You found the note useful," Wren said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "Did you send it?" "I had it sent." A pause. "I have been watching the Ashvale house since the Reverend died, waiting to see what his widow would do with what he left behind." She looked at Nora with those steady eyes. "Most people in your position would have taken what the solicitor offered and moved on." "What did the solicitor offer?" "Enough. Not everything, but enough that most people would have found it sufficient." Another pause. "You did not go to the solicitor." "I went to the study first." Wren nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already believed. "Callum Ashvale came to me 3 days before he died," she said. "He walked out here on his own, did not take a horse, arrived in the late afternoon with his boots worn through from the road." She looked at her hands briefly, then back at Nora. "He told me what he had done, not in detail, in the way of a man who has finally said a thing aloud that he has been carrying so long it has reshaped him from the inside." She paused. "He asked me for forgiveness." The word fell into the morning air and stayed there. "What did you tell him?" Nora asked. Her voice was steady. She was holding herself very still. "I told him that forgiveness was not mine to give, that what had been taken from my people had been taken from my people, and that my absolution of him would mean nothing to the ones who had lost grazing lands and water access, and the boundaries that their grandparents had negotiated in good faith." Wren looked at her without softness, but without cruelty. "I told him that the only thing that would mean anything was the truth being known. And I told him that if he could not do that himself, then he should find a way to send someone who could." Nora understood then, not gradually, not by degrees, but all at once. The way you understand something when every separate piece of it clicks into its correct position simultaneously. The study left unlocked, the ledgers arranged in a particular order, the deed in the second drawer on the left, the first document she would have looked for, the one that would have led her to open the first ledger, the one that started everything. He had arranged it. Failing in life, he had arranged it in whatever time he had after that afternoon walk and before his heart gave out, leaving behind not a confession, but a path. Imperfect and indirect and requiring someone with exactly the right kind of memory to follow it. She did not cry. She was not sure what she felt was the kind of thing that expressed itself in tears. It was larger and stranger than that, and it required more room than crying aloud. Wren watched her. After a moment, she said, with a quietness that was its own form of consideration, "He was not a bad man. In my experience, the worst damage is rarely done by bad men. It is done by ordinary men who make one accommodation and then find that the second accommodation is easier than the first, because they have already established the habit." Nora looked at her. He could have stopped it. Yes. He chose not to. Yes. Wren was silent for a moment. He also chose to walk out here in worn-through boots and ask for a way to make it right. Both of those things are true. They will have to live in you together. There is no resolution that removes one of them. Beside her, Gideon had been silent throughout this exchange, with the quality of silence of someone who is not absent but is holding himself back from the conversation because the conversation does not belong to him. Nora was aware of him the way you are aware of a steady thing beside you in an unsteady moment, not looking at it directly but drawing on its presence anyway. Wren turned to him then. "You came here 4 years ago," she said. "Yes. I sent you away. Yes. I was not ready then. The shape of what you were asking would have caused damage before it could cause repair. The community was in a different position." She held his gaze. "I am telling you this not as an apology, but as an explanation, because I think you have spent 4 years believing the refusal was about you." Something in Gideon's face shifted, briefly and deeply, the way ground shifts when something long buried finally moves. He said nothing, but he nodded once. Wren rose from her chair with the deliberate ease of someone who manages a body that has strong opinions about certain movements. She went inside and returned carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth, a flat rectangular bundle that she held with both hands. She set it on the ground between them and unwrapped it slowly. It was a ledger, older than Callum's records by the look of it, the cover worn to a dark softness, the pages thicker and more irregular than the machine-made paper of the official documents. She opened it to a page marked with a strip of leather and held it for Nora to see. The writing was in 2 languages, columns running parallel, and the map drawn into the margin was hand-sketched and old but precise in the way of something recorded by someone who knew the land with their body and was translating that knowledge into marks on paper. The boundary line ran exactly where Gideon's map said it had always run. The date at the top of the page predated the first of Callum's settlement records by more than 30 years. "This is the original agreement," Nora said. "This is the original agreement," Wren confirmed, "and the 6 pages following it record every subsequent acknowledgement of that agreement by every party who passed through this territory in the decades after. It has never been disputed. It was simply ignored, because ignoring it was more convenient than engaging with it, and because the people who held it had no seat at any table where ignoring it could be challenged." Nora looked at the page for a long moment. Then she looked up at Wren. "This is enough. This is necessary," Wren said. "Necessary and sufficient are different things. This establishes what was. You still need someone to establish what was done to change it, and to confirm the mechanism by which it was changed." She looked at Nora steadily. "There is a man on the eastern edge of these lands. You know his name. I know you know it because Callum would have left the thread for you to find. He refused to speak to Gideon 4 years ago. He is older now and more unwell, and he has been carrying this for a very long time, which is its own kind of exhaustion. Ren paused. He will see you, not because you are persuasive or because circumstances have changed, because I will send word ahead that you are coming, and because he owes this community a debt that he has known about for years and has not yet found the courage to pay. Her voice was neither harsh nor gentle on this, simply accurate. Sometimes courage arrives late. It is still courage. They stayed through the midday hour, going through the original record with Ren's guidance, Nora committing each page to the part of her mind that held things without losing them. Gideon cross-referencing against the maps he had brought, rolled and tied to his saddle. The work was quieter than the work they had done at his table, the three of them moving through the documents together with a shared focus that felt different from the collaboration she and Gideon had developed in his study, broader in some way, more weighted with what it represented. Before they left, Ren called Nora back while Gideon went to the horses. A small girl had appeared at the edge of the camp while they were preparing to leave, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, watching them with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to disguise her attention. Ren said something brief in the Duskwater tongue, and the child came forward. She looked at Nora for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pressed 2 small, smooth stones into Nora's hand, one the pale color of winter grass, one the darker color of wet earth, and walked away without waiting for a response. "My granddaughter," Ren said simply. "She does not offer those to everyone." Nora closed her fingers around the stones and said nothing. "You will go to see the old witness tomorrow," Ren continued, "and then you will have what you need. But having what you need and knowing what to do with it are not the same thing. And I want to say this to you before you ride back." She looked at Nora with those eyes that had seen a long time of things. The shape of what comes next matters as much as the outcome. I have watched enough settlements and hearings and resolutions to know that the manner in which truth is delivered determines whether it takes root or merely causes more damage. She paused. "You have a gift for knowing what is true. You will need a different gift for knowing how to say it." Nora thought about this on the road back. She thought about it while the landscape unreeled around her, and the afternoon light went from direct to slanted, and the shadows of the horses stretched long behind them. She was aware of Gideon riding beside her, and of the rolled maps at his saddle, and of the image of the original record that was now lodged in her memory in full detail. Every line, every word, in both languages, every margin note. They had ridden perhaps half the distance back when Gideon said, without preface, "She told you something." After. Yes. He did not ask what it was. She considered whether to offer it anyway, and decided that she would, because they had passed the point where withholding things served any purpose. She said that having what you need and knowing what to do with it are not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved beneath them with their steady, ground-eating rhythm. "She is right," he said. "I know." Another stretch of quiet. The light was doing something particular with the pale ground ahead of them, turning it to a color that had no precise name, somewhere between gold and gray, and something warmer than either. "She told you about Callum," Gideon said. It was not a question. "Yes." "What she said about ordinary men making accommodations." "Yes." He was quiet again for long enough that she thought he was done. Then he said, "I have spent 8 years hating the specific version of him that ruined me." The deliberate man who looked at my survey and chose to undermine it. A pause. It is harder to hate the other version. The man who walked out there in worn-through boots. Nora looked at the horizon ahead. I am finding that I have to hold both of them at the same time. It is not comfortable. No, he said. I imagine it is not. They rode in silence after that, but it was the kind of silence that had accumulated meaning, that was richer than it would have been an hour earlier, weighted with what had been said and what had not needed to be said, because the saying of some things made the other things understood, without requiring their own words. They reached his place as the last of the daylight was making its final arrangements. She had intended to take her ledgers and ride on to town, but the ride to Wren Duskwater and back had been long, and the day had been the kind that used a person thoroughly. And when Gideon said without looking at her that there was no reason to make the road in the dark when the chair was available, she found that she did not argue. He made food this time, something simple over the fire, and they ate at the table with the maps pushed to one side, and the meal was plain and warm and sufficient, and neither of them commented on the fact of eating together, because commenting on it would have made it into something that required categorization, and it was more comfortable as something that simply was. After she told him about what she had realized at Wren Duskwater's camp, about the unlocked study and the ordered ledgers and the deed in the second drawer, he listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect of him, the particular quality of his attention that gave the person speaking room to find the end of what they were saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, he trusted you to see it. He trusted my memory, she said, which is not entirely the same thing. He knew what your memory was capable of. He arranged things for that specific capability. Gideon looked at her across the table. That is not a small thing to know about a person you have lived with for 20 years. It suggests he was paying attention, even when he was making choices that suggested otherwise. She sat with that. It was uncomfortable in the specific way of something that required her to revise a version of events she had already committed to, the version in which Callum's silence had been comprehensive, in which his failure had been a failure of attention as much as courage. This was a more complicated version, a version in which he had seen her clearly, had known her capability, and had still chosen to do what he did, which was worse in some ways and better in others, and did not resolve cleanly in either direction. He is not someone I can simply be angry at, she said, or simply forgive. Both of those would be easier. Yes, Gideon said. He looked at the fire. I know something about that. She looked at him. In the firelight, his face was less guarded than it was in daylight, the way all faces are less guarded in firelight, the warmth of it softening the surfaces people maintain in brighter conditions. She thought about what Wren had said, about 4 years of a refusal that had not been about him, and about what it cost to carry something as a personal verdict that had not been personally meant. 8 years is a long time to be outside, she said quietly. He did not ask what she meant by outside. He understood the word as she had meant it, as a description of a particular kind of exile that is not geographic but social, the state of having been removed from the community of credibility and left to exist in the margins of other people's certainty. It changes you, he said, not complaining, reporting. After enough time, you stop expecting to come back in. You start building a different kind of life around the assumption of the margin. He paused. It is functional. It is just not what you thought your life was going to look like. What did you think it was going to look like? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved, not deflecting. "Useful," he said finally. "I thought it was going to look useful. I was good at the work. I believed in what it was supposed to accomplish. Clear documentation, honest records, land that was described accurately so that the people living on it knew what they had and what they did not." He looked at his hands on the table, those calloused, ink-stained hands. "I still believe in it. That part did not change." Nora looked at him for a moment. "That part did not change," she repeated, not as an echo but as a recognition, the noting of something that mattered. Then, "What did change?" He looked at her across the table, and in the firelight, his eyes were the eyes of someone who had arrived, through a long route, at the vicinity of honesty. "I stopped believing the work could matter if the people holding the power to act on it had already decided it would not." A pause. "I am revising that position." She held his gaze. "As am I," she said, in the other direction. Something shifted in the room, or in the quality of the air between them, or in the particular calibration of the silence. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened when two people recognized, simultaneously and without announcing it, that they had arrived at a piece of understanding that belonged to both of them equally. Outside the window, the night was complete and quiet. The fire had settled to its reliable low burning. On the table between them, the maps and ledgers lay in their accumulated disorder, holding the evidence of years, waiting for the next movement in a story that was not finished. Nora thought about tomorrow, about the old witness on the far edge of the Duskwater lands, waiting in his own way to be found, about the shape of what would come after, the gathering of everything they had into a form that could be said aloud in front of people who had the power to hear it and act on it. About what Wren had told her, that the manner of delivery mattered as much as the content. She thought about her own memory, that strange and reliable instrument that had been waiting unused for 20 years, like a tool left in a drawer, still sharp, still capable, simply unasked. She picked up her notebook and turned to a clean page. She began to write. Across the table, Gideon watched her for a moment. Then he pulled one of his maps toward him and picked up his pen. The fire held steady. The night continued its long, patient work. And in the room, where a disgraced surveyor and a widow had spread the evidence of years between them, two people sat and worked and did not speak. And the silence was the most honest thing either of them had inhabited in a very long time. The old man's name was Harlan Goss, and he lived at the end of a track that had not been maintained by anyone in a considerable number of years. The grasses had reclaimed the center of it, growing tall between the wheel ruts, and the trees on either side had extended themselves inward until the track felt less like a road than like a suggestion, something that had once been intention and was now merely memory preserved in the shape of the ground. They rode in single file. Gideon went first because he had been here once before, and because the track required someone who knew where it became uncertain. Nora rode behind him and watched the landscape change around them into something that felt genuinely remote, not the managed remoteness of a place deliberately set apart, but the organic remoteness of somewhere that had simply been left alone long enough to become itself again. The house was small and very old, built from the local stone in the manner of someone who had intended permanence without ornamentation. A thread of smoke rose from the chimney, pale against the morning sky. A woman of perhaps 30 stood on the step watching them come. She had the face of someone who had been expecting this and had made her peace with it. And as they dismounted, she came forward and took their horses without speaking, tying them to the post at the side of the house with practiced efficiency. "He is inside," she said. "He has been up since before the light. He said he wanted to be sitting up when you came." She looked at Nora with a directness that was not unfriendly. "He said to tell the woman to come in first, alone." Gideon looked at Nora. She looked back at him, and they had by now enough of a shared language in the space of a glance to communicate what needed to be communicated. She handed him her saddlebag and went inside. Harlan Goss was very old in the way of people who have become architectural, who have been in one place long enough that the place has shaped itself around them and they around it, so that removing them would leave a gap in the room the way removing a load-bearing element leaves a gap in a structure. He was seated in a chair by the window with a wool blanket over his lap and his hands resting on top of it, and he watched Nora cross the room toward him with eyes that were clouded at the edges but still precise at their center, still capable of the particular focused attention of someone who has spent a lifetime reading situations. She took the chair across from him without being invited, because invitation would have required him to perform a hospitality that would have cost him something, and she did not want to cost him anything unnecessary before he had given what she had come for. "You are his wife," he said. His voice was thin, but his diction was careful, each word fully formed. "His widow," Nora said. "He has been gone just over a month." Harlan Goss looked at her for a long moment. "I heard," he said. "Then he came to see me, about 2 years before the end. He told me what he was carrying. We talked for a long time." A pause, and in the pause, something moved through his face that was not quite shame and was not quite relief, but was in the country of both. "I told him I could not speak, that I had reasons I could not explain, and that he would have to find another way." "He found a way," Nora said. "Yes, I can see that he did." The old man looked at her hands, at the notebook she was holding, at the quality of her attention. "You have his ledgers." "I have read his ledgers. I have them in my memory." Something shifted in Harlan Goss's expression, a recognizing. "He told me about your memory. He said it was the thing he was most counting on." The words landed in her chest with a particular weight. She sat with them for a moment before she spoke. "Then let me tell you what I have found, and you can tell me what is true and what I have missed, and we can establish together what you are able to confirm." He nodded once, and she began. She took him through it in sequence, the way she had organized it in her notebook and in her mind, the progression of settlements and the migration of the boundary and the pattern that only became visible across the full span of years. She spoke plainly and without emphasis, because emphasis was a form of persuasion, and she did not want to persuade him. She wanted to give him the shape of what she knew and let him find his own orientation within it. He listened with his eyes closed for most of it, which she took not as inattention, but as the opposite. The method of a man who absorbed information better without the interference of visual input. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the dry grass in long waves that she could hear through the old window glass. "The witness signature on the Duskwater boundary settlement," he said finally. His eyes were still closed. "The one that appeared in 4 of the major hearings. Yes, that was my name, my signature." A long pause. "And then it was not my signature, and I said nothing, because by the time I understood what had been done with it, I was already implicated in what had been done, and speaking would have required me to explain why I had not spoken sooner, which would have been its own kind of undoing. He opened his eyes and looked at her directly. I was afraid. That is the plain truth of it. I was afraid, and I told myself that the harm was already done, and that my speaking could not undo it, which was true, but was not the reason. The reason was fear. Nora held his gaze. Will you say that? She asked, not pressing, simply asking. I am very old, he said. I have been carrying this for a long time, and carrying it has not been free. He looked out the window at the pale sky. Wren Duskwater sent word yesterday. She said that the shape of a resolution matters as much as the resolution itself, and that a man who tells the truth late has still told the truth. He was quiet for a moment. I have been waiting for someone to give me that particular permission. Nora thought about Wren Duskwater, who had sent word ahead, who had chosen the timing of everything with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this for a very long time. She thought about the shape of things, the way certain people moved through the world arranging conditions rather than outcomes, creating circumstances in which the right things became possible rather than trying to force them into existence. I will write down what you tell me, she said, and you will sign it, and that, together with what we already have, will be enough. He nodded. Bring the other one in, he said. The surveyor. I want him to hear it too. Gideon came in and sat against the wall, and for the next 2 hours, Harlan Goss talked, and Nora wrote, and the room filled up with the accumulated weight of what had been withheld for years, finally finding its way into the open air. He was precise in the way of someone who had rehearsed this in his mind for a long time, and Nora's pen moved steadily across the pages of her notebook, capturing everything in the exact words he used, because his words were the document and she was only its vessel. When it was done, she held out the notebook and a pen. His hand trembled slightly as he signed, but the signature was clear and deliberate, the work of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. They rode back in the early afternoon. For the first hour, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was of a kind that Nora recognized from certain moments in her life when something significant had concluded and had not yet been fully absorbed, when the mind was still processing the shape of what had changed and had not yet caught up with the implications. The sky above them was high and pale and entirely indifferent to the weight of what they were carrying in a notebook in Nora's coat pocket, and the landscape unrolled around them at the horse's pace, unhurried, unchanged, the same ground it had always been, regardless of what the document said about who held the right to it. It was Gideon who broke the silence. He said, Prairie will have heard by now that we went to Wren Duskwater. Yes, Nora said, and that we came out here today. Almost certainly. He has 2 days before the community council meets to finalize the transfer. He was looking at the road ahead. He will not wait to see what we do with what we have. Nora had been thinking about this since they left Harlan Goss's house. She had been thinking about the structure of what they had built over the past days, the original record from Wren's ledger, the pattern documented in Callum's files, the witness testimony now in her notebook, and she had been turning it in her mind the way you turn a mechanism to understand how it fits together, looking for the weakest point, the place where a determined adversary would apply pressure. The weakest point was not the evidence. The evidence was, she believed, complete. The weakest point was time and audience. and the particular politics of a community that had trusted Callum Ashvale for 20 years and would not immediately welcome what his ledgers contained. "We need the council meeting," she said, "not as a legal proceeding, as a public one. Everything we have needs to be seen by everyone at once, so that there is no version of events in which some people know and others do not. No space for private conversations that manage the information before it reaches the people it most affects." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That is a significant risk. Public proceedings can go wrong in ways that private ones do not. Emotion runs differently in a crowd than in a room." "I know." She thought about what Wren had told her, about the manner of delivery mattering as much as the content. But the alternative is to bring this to whatever formal authority is available to us, and that authority has already demonstrated that it can be managed. Documents can be buried. Witnesses can be discouraged. The only thing that cannot be easily managed is a room full of people who have all heard the same thing at the same time. He looked at her sideways. "You have thought about this." "I have thought about very little else for the past several days." They rode on. The afternoon was deepening around them, the light going from its direct midday angle to something more horizontal and golden, the kind of light that made the familiar landscape look briefly unfamiliar, as if seen from a slight distance, as if the world was temporarily outside itself and looking back. She did not immediately understand what she was seeing when they came over the rise that put Gideon's property in view. Her mind registered the image and spent a fraction of a second trying to fit it into a normal explanation before the normal explanation ran out. The outbuilding at the back of his property was on fire. Not fully engulfed, not yet. But the smoke was heavy and dark, and the orange at its base was established and purposeful in the way of a fire that had been deliberately set and given a sound beginning. The main house was intact. The fire was in the structure where he stored his older survey equipment, his reference materials, the archive of original documentation that predated even his own records. Gideon had already spurred his horse forward before she had fully processed what she was seeing. She followed, and by the time they reached the property, he was already off his horse and moving toward the well, and she dismounted and went to help him. And what followed was 20 minutes of brutal, urgent work, hauling water and directing it, moving around the structure to find the angles that mattered, acting with the focused physical intensity of people who are operating past thought and directly through their bodies. The fire took the back half of the outbuilding and was stopped at the partition wall, which was stone and held. The front half, where the older equipment was stored, survived. The archive of original documentation, which Gideon had kept in a metal-lidded box against the stone wall, survived. The box was scorched on the outside, but intact. He opened it with shaking hands and looked at the contents for a long moment, and then he closed it again. They stood in the yard with the smoke still rising and the smell of it heavy in the air, that particular smell of deliberate destruction, acrid and purposeful, nothing like the clean smell of a cooking fire or the comfortable smell of a hearth. Gideon looked at what remained of the outbuilding. His face was controlled in a way that she recognized as the control of someone managing something large, containing it by a main effort because releasing it would not serve any useful purpose at this moment. He wanted to see if there was anything here he had missed, Nora said. He did not know what we had taken out already. He did not know about the notebook. Gideon looked at her. Or he wanted to send a message. Both, she said. Both at once. She watched him look at the damage, at the years of work and the structure that had held it, and the specific violation of someone reaching into the place where a person keeps their most defended things and destroying what they can reach. She understood what she was watching. It was the particular grief of someone who has already lost a great deal and has built their remaining life around what was left, and is now watching a piece of that remainder burn. She did not offer comfort in words, because words would have been insufficient, and he would have known they were insufficient, and the gap between what words could do and what the moment required would have made things worse. Instead, she went to the well and drew a bucket and brought it to him, because his hands were blackened from the work, and the water was something real and immediate that she could actually provide. He looked at the bucket, then he looked at her. Something in his face that had been held very tight for a very long time moved, briefly, like ground shifting. He took the bucket. He washed his hands. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I should have expected this. You could not have prevented it," she said. "I could have moved the archive earlier. I knew he was watching. I knew he would act when we got close enough." He set the bucket down. "I told myself there was time." "There was time," she said. "We got everything that mattered out before this happened. The notebook, the original record from Wren's ledger, the testimony this morning. The fire got the oldest survey equipment and a set of reference maps that can be reconstructed from what I carry here." She tapped her temple, and she meant it practically rather than dramatically, as a simple statement of fact. He burned what he could find. He did not know what we had already made unfindable. Gideon looked at her. He was standing in the yard with the smoke curling above him, and his hands still damp from the bucket, and his face showing the complicated truth of someone who has been hurt by something they had seen coming and could not entirely prevent, which is its own specific kind of pain, distinct from surprise, more intimate than outrage. "He will come directly now," Gideon said. "No more signals. He has shown his hand, and he will know that we know what it means." As if the words had been a cue, they heard the sound of a horse on the road. Then, two. Then the particular sound of several horses moving together with the intention of arrival rather than passage. Silas Prairie came through the gate with two men behind him. He was dressed as he always was, well and without ostentation, and his face held its permanent expression of reasonable concern. Though the edges of it were tighter than usual, the reasonableness maintained its slightly more effort. He looked at the smoke rising from the outbuilding. He looked at Gideon and Nora standing in the yard. He did not look at the smoke for long. "Mrs. Ashvale," he said. His voice was warm. "I heard there had been an incident out here. I wanted to come personally to make sure you were unharmed." "That is very considerate," Nora said. "These are dangerous circumstances for a woman on her own, particularly one who has become involved in matters that she may not fully understand." He looked at Gideon briefly, a glance that contained a great deal that was not in the words. "I think it would be worth having a conversation about where things stand and whether there is a more comfortable arrangement for everyone." "I am comfortable where I am," Nora said. Something moved in his expression, controlled immediately. "You are holding documents that belong to your late husband's estate, and you have been meeting with a man whose professional conduct has been formally questioned, and you have made inquiries in communities that have their own complicated relationship with the structures of this territory." He paused. "I am trying to protect you from the consequences of decisions made in grief. Nothing more. Nora looked at him. She had thought, in the hours of preparation she had done over the past days, about this moment or something like it, the moment when Prairie stood in front of her and made his final reasonable offer. She had thought about what she would feel, whether it would be fear, whether it would be anger, whether the permanent pleasantness of his face would have the effect on her that pleasantness was designed to have, the softening of resistance, the suggestion that aggression was unnecessary when accommodation was available. What she felt, standing in a yard smelling of deliberate smoke with a notebook in her coat pocket and a memory that had not missed a single page she had read in the past week, was something she could only describe as clarity. Not confidence, not certainty about outcomes, but the specific, clear-eyed steadiness of someone who has looked at what is true and decided to remain standing in front of it. "I will see you at the council meeting in 2 days," she said. "We will have a great deal to discuss there." His expression held for a moment longer, and then something in it changed, and for a brief instant she saw behind the permanent reasonableness to what was underneath it, which was not cruelty and was not malice in any simple sense, but was the cold, flat quality of someone who has organized their life around an outcome and is now processing the genuine possibility that the outcome will not be theirs. It was there for only a moment. Then it was gone, and the warmth was back, and he nodded pleasantly and said something about hoping she would reconsider, and then turned his horse and rode back through the gate with his 2 men following. Gideon stood beside her and watched them go. The dust from their horses hung in the air for a while after they rounded the bend, and then the wind took it. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she confirmed. The afternoon was still. The smoke from the outbuilding had thinned to a pale thread. The light had gone fully horizontal now. That last stage before evening, when everything cast long shadows, and the world looked briefly more itself than it usually did, clarified by the angle of the light into something closer to its actual nature. Gideon turned toward the house. Then he stopped. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she understood that something was happening that required a moment, and she waited. When he turned around, his face was different in a way that was difficult to name precisely. Not broken, not undone, but open in a way it usually was not. The careful surface of it temporarily insufficient to contain what was behind it. "I have been doing this alone for 8 years, he said. His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something she had not heard in it before, something unguarded. 8 years of building this piece by piece in a room that nobody came to, believing it mattered and not being able to make it matter." He stopped. He looked at the scorched wall of the outbuilding. "I am finding it difficult to account for the fact that I am not alone in it anymore. I do not know what to do with that." Nora looked at him. She thought about what it cost to say a thing like that, for a person like him, in circumstances like these. She thought about the 8 years of the margin and what they had done to his capacity for expecting anything from other people, and about what it required to say aloud that the expectation had changed. "You do not have to do anything with it," she said quietly. "Not right now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went inside. She stood in the yard alone for a while, with the pale smoke still rising behind her and the evening coming in from the east. She thought about 2 days. She thought about everything they had assembled and everything that depended on the next movement of it. She thought about Wren Duskwater and the original ledger and Harlan Goss's shaking hand signing his name to something that had been unsigned for too long. She thought about a room full of people hearing the same thing at the same time and what that could and could not accomplish. Then she went inside and she sat down at the table and she opened her notebook to the testimony she had recorded that morning, and she began to think about the shape of what she would say. Not what she knew everything she needed to know, but how she would say it, the order of it, the voice of it, the manner of it, which Wren had told her mattered as much as the content. She wrote for a long time. The evening deepened around her. Gideon moved quietly in the other part of the house, and the sounds of him were ordinary and sufficient. And outside the night came on with its usual patient indifference to the weight of human things. And inside the lamp burned steadily. And Nora Ashvale wrote, and the words came with the particular ease of something that has been true for a long time, and has finally found its form. The council hall was the largest room in the settlement, built in an earlier era when people had believed that the community would grow faster than it did, leaving a space that always felt slightly too large for the gatherings it hosted. On the morning of the meeting, it filled in a way Nora had not expected, people arriving early and standing along the walls when the benches filled, the murmur of them building and then settling as the hour approached. She stood at the front with her notebook in her hands and watched them come in and felt, without surprise, that she was not afraid. She had been afraid at other points in the preceding days. She had been afraid the night the paddock gate was opened, and the night of the fire, and the morning she had ridden to Gideon's place for the first time with a tangle of ledgers and no clear idea of what she was walking into. Fear had been appropriate in those moments, and she had used it correctly, as information rather than instruction. But standing here now, in this room that was filling with people who had trusted her husband and who were about to be told something difficult about that trust, what she felt was not fear. It was the particular steadiness of someone who has done the preparation and arrived at the moment and has nothing left to do but be present in it. Gideon sat in the second row. He had asked her the previous evening whether she wanted him to stand at the front with her, and she had thought about it honestly before answering. She had told him that she needed to do the first part alone. Not because his presence was unwelcome, but because the story she was telling had started in a room that she alone had entered, and it needed to begin from that same place of singular accountability. He had understood without requiring further explanation, which was one of the things she had come to rely on in him without quite having marked the moment when she started. Wren Duskwater was there. She sat near the back with 3 members of the Duskwater community, and her presence was not dramatic. She had not announced herself or entered with ceremony. She had simply arrived and taken a seat and sat with her hands in her lap and her face composed into its characteristic expression of patient attention. Several people looked at her when she came in. She did not acknowledge the looking. Silas Prairie was also there. He arrived with 2 associates and took a seat on the far side of the room with the positioned confidence of a man who has calculated that the best response to an uncertain situation is to appear entirely certain about it. He nodded pleasantly at Nora when their eyes met across the room. She returned the nod with equal pleasantness and looked away. The council elder called the meeting to order. He spoke briefly about the purpose of the gathering, the pending land transfer, the need for any final objections to be raised before the documentation was finalized. He spoke in the practiced tone of someone who expected the proceedings to be orderly and concluded within the hour. Then he said that Mrs. Ashvale had requested time to speak, and he sat down. Nora did not open her notebook immediately. She stood for a moment and looked at the room, at the faces turned toward her, some curious, some politely attentive, some carrying the particular wariness of people who had known her as Callum Ashvale's wife for 20 years, and were not entirely certain who she was without that designation. She said, "I want to tell you what I found in my husband's study. Not what I concluded, not what I believe, but what I found. The documents themselves. What they say and what they show when you read them in sequence rather than in isolation. I am going to ask you to hear all of it before you decide what you think about it, because the pattern is only visible when the whole span of it is in front of you, and I am asking for your patience with that." The room was quiet. She began. She spoke for a long time. She spoke from memory, which meant she spoke without hesitation and without the interruption of shuffled pages. And the effect of this was something she had hoped for, but had not been entirely certain she could produce, the sense that the information was not being read to them, but given to them directly, person to person, as testimony rather than presentation. She took them through the 15 years of settlements in chronological order, laying each piece beside the next, building the picture by accumulation the way it had built itself for her in the candlelit room on the first night. She did not editorialize. She did not use words like fraud or deliberate or criminal. She used the language of the documents themselves, the measured language of boundary markers and witness signatures and parcels described in the dry terms of survey work, and she let the pattern speak for itself, trusting that the people in the room were capable of seeing what the pattern meant without being told what to feel about it. About halfway through, she heard the quality of the silence in the room change. It was a subtle shift. The difference between the silence of people listening politely and the silence of people who have stopped thinking about anything except what they are hearing. She registered it without pausing. When she reached the forged signatures, she said what they were plainly and without inflation, and she said how she had identified them and what her basis for identification was. And she said that this identification was corroborated by a living witness whose testimony she had taken 3 days prior, and she held up the notebook and said that his signed statement was in it. She said, Harlan Goss's name. A sound moved through the room. Not loud, not disruptive. Simply the involuntary sound of recognition, of a name connecting to a face that many people in the room had known. An old man who had attended every significant community event for decades before he stopped coming to town. Nora let the sound settle. Then she continued. She finished by describing the original Duskwater record, its age and its contents, and the boundary it documented. And she said that Wren Duskwater was present and could speak to its provenance for anyone who had questions. She said this without drama, simply as a statement of available corroboration, and she looked briefly toward the back of the room where Wren sat, and Wren inclined her head slightly. Then Nora closed her notebook and said, "That is what I found. You know this community and its history better than I can claim to. I trust you to know what to do with what I have told you." She sat down. The silence after was the longest silence she had experienced in a public room. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, which is a very long time when a room full of people is holding it together. Then the council elder said, in a voice that had lost some of its practiced smoothness, "Mr. Pryor, is there a response you wish to make?" Silas Pryor rose. He was composed. He was, as he had always been, impeccably composed, and he began to speak in the warm, reasonable voice that had served him so well for so long, and Nora watched the room as he spoke rather than watching him. She saw the moment it began to shift. It was not a single moment, but a cumulative one. The gradual change in the posture of people who are listening to a man whose credibility is draining out of him in real time, not because he is saying anything wrong, but because he is saying things that require them to disbelieve what they have just heard, and they find that they cannot do it. Not because Nora had been persuasive in any emotional sense, because she had given them the documents and let them see the pattern and trusted their intelligence, and the intelligence she had trusted was now doing its work. She saw one of Pryor's associates stand and move quietly toward the door, then the other. Pryor did not see them go immediately, and when he did, the composed face held for one moment longer before it adjusted into something slightly different, something that was still controlled but was no longer entirely confident about what it was controlling. He concluded his remarks. He sat down. The council elder looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he said that in light of the material presented, the finalization of the transfer would be postponed pending a thorough review of the documentation underlying the settlements in question. He said it in the measured language of institutional process, which drained some of the drama out of it, but the meaning was clear and the room received it clearly. It was not, Nora understood, an ending. It was the beginning of a process that would take considerably longer than a morning and would encounter resistance at various points, and would require the documents she had assembled to withstand scrutiny from people whose professional purpose was to find their weaknesses. All of that was still ahead. What had happened in this room was not a resolution in any final sense. What had happened was that the shape of the situation had permanently changed. The transfer was stopped. The pattern was in the room, held now in the memory of everyone who had been present, which meant it could not be buried under more paper or managed through private conversations. It was public. It was known. And the things that are public and known are subject to a different set of forces than the things that are private and suspected. She walked out of the hall into the sharp morning air and stood for a moment with her face toward the light. She heard Gideon behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She needed the moment to be what it was, the specific sensation of having done the thing you prepared to do, and having it land in the world in a way that was real, that had weight, that had changed something. She had not been certain, even in the preparation, that it would feel like anything in particular. She had thought it might feel like relief. It did not feel like relief. It felt quieter than that, more interior. After a moment she turned. He was standing a few feet behind her with his hat in his hands, and his face showing the open quality she had seen only a few times, the expression he wore when the careful surface of him was temporarily insufficient for what the moment required. "Harlan Goss's name in that room," he said quietly. "The way people responded to it." He stopped. He looked at her. 8 years ago, I thought if I could just show people what was true, it would be enough. I was wrong about that. I had the truth, and it meant nothing, because I did not know how to put it in front of people in a form they could receive." He paused again. "You knew how to do that." Nora looked at him for a moment. "You gave me 8 years of maps," she said. "The form would have been nothing without what was in it." From behind them came the sound of the hall emptying, people moving out into the morning, their voices carrying the particular quality of people processing something significant, the low, urgent sound of a community rearranging its understanding. Through the door, she could see Wren Duskwater moving with unhurried deliberateness through the departing crowd, and the elder of the community council making his way toward her, and the beginning of a conversation that had needed to happen for a long time. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. She turned it over once, feeling the worn cover, the slight bulk of the filled pages. Then she thought about Callum, and the worn-through boots, and the study arranged in the specific order of a man doing the last thing available to him. She had been carrying him as a weight since the night she found the first page. She had not been sure until this moment what it would feel like to set that weight down, or even precisely when it would become possible. She found that she could not set him down entirely, and did not think she should. He was too much a part of the 15 years of evidence, too woven into the events that had led here. But she could hold him differently. The way Wren had said, the two true things living in her together, the failure and the worn-through boots, the harm and the path he had tried to leave toward its correction. Both of those things, neither one canceling the other. She looked up. Gideon was watching her with the patient quality of someone who had decided not to interrupt whatever was happening. "There is a great deal still to do," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "The documentation will need to be formally submitted. Harlan Goss's testimony will need to be properly witnessed and recorded. Wren's ledger will need to be presented to whatever body takes up the review." She turned the notebook in her hands once more. "The truth being in a room is not the same as the truth being acted on." "No," he said, "it is not." He looked at her. "But it is a different problem than the one we had a week ago." She considered that. A week ago, she had been sitting in Callum's study with a candle and a ledger and no one to tell. A week ago, Gideon had been at the end of an unmarked track with his maps and his 8 years of isolated certainty. A week ago, Wren Duskwater had been waiting for someone to come asking the right questions, and Harlan Goss had been waiting for someone to give him the particular permission of being told it was not too late. A great deal had changed in the shape of a week. "What will you do now?" Gideon asked. The question was simple and direct, which was how he asked things. Nora thought about the house in town, which was no longer the house it had been when Callum was alive, no longer a fixed point, but simply a structure that she happened to occupy. She thought about the solicitor and the estate and the practical machinery of widowhood that still needed to be navigated. She thought about the work that remained to be done in this particular matter, the documentation and the formal submissions and the sustained attention that a review would require. She thought about a room with maps on the wall and a table large enough to spread 15 years of evidence across, and a man who spoke plainly and made tea that was too strong and knew how to hold a silence correctly. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "that the work we have started will require someone to see it through. Someone who knows the documents and can speak to the pattern when it is questioned." She met his eyes. "I have also been thinking that the work would benefit from someone with access to accurate survey maps and the expertise to defend them." Gideon looked at her for a moment. The morning light was straightforward and clear around them, the kind of light that showed things accurately without flattering them. And in that light, his face was simply what it was, marked by weather and time and 8 years of the margin, and honest in the way of someone who had nothing left to maintain appearances for. "That sounds like an arrangement," he said. "It does," she agreed. A pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that has something forming in it. "The chair by the fire," he said. is still not comfortable. I am aware of that, she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country. She felt something move in her own face in response, an answering warmth, quiet and genuine, and entirely without the performance that had characterized so many of her expressions over so many years of being a particular kind of wife in a particular kind of community. She tucked the notebook into her coat pocket. The 2 stones that Wren's granddaughter had pressed into her hand on the morning they left the Duskwater camp were there too. The small, smooth ones, one the pale color of winter grass, and one the darker color of wet earth. And Nora had carried them without knowing why, and found now that she did not need a reason for them. Some things did not require explanation. They required only keeping. She looked at the horizon, the long, unbroken line of it, the pale sky meeting the darker ground, the infinite suggestion of what lay beyond what was visible. She had been looking at that line her whole life in this territory, and had always seen it as the edge of something. She was not sure when that had changed. Somewhere in the past week it had become something else, not an edge, but a continuation. Not the end of what was known, but the beginning of what had not yet been reached. She began to walk toward the horses. Gideon fell into step beside her, and they walked without hurrying across the open ground in the clean morning light. And neither of them said anything more, because nothing more was required. And the silence between them was the most honest and the most inhabited silence that either of them had occupied in a very long time.